more than 3 decades, a serial killer stalked families, broke into their homes, and murdered without warning, then disappeared as if he had never existed. He didn't act in a frenzy or lose control. He committed some of the most methodical and disturbing crimes in American criminal history. He made no exceptions and killed everyone to give life to his most twisted fantasies. He planned his attacks carefully, watched his victims beforehand, and chose moments when no one would suspect a thing. After each crime, he returned to invisibility. He kept souvenirs. He wrote detailed accounts of what he had done, and even Nick named himself BTK, which stood for bind, torture, and kill. He relived his crimes long after the bodies were discovered, and for years, investigators worked relentlessly, but with no leads, all they could do was wait. For decades, his crimes went unsolved, until he made a decision that would completely expose him. In search of fame and notoriety, the BTK Killer contacted the police and media, trying to keep his lore alive and keep people talking about him. But during this process, he made a very small mistake that finally led the police to him. This is the story of how one of the most methodical serial killers in American history didn't get caught by evidence, witnesses, or police work, but by his own hunger for notoriety. This is the story of Dennis Rader, the BTK Killer. Dennis Rader was born on March 9, 1945, in Pittsburgh, Kansas. He was the oldest of 4 sons, raised in a household that, from the outside, looked stable and deeply religious. His father was a former Marine who worked long hours. His mother was a bookkeeper who did the same. Both were devoted churchgoers, and Dennis was baptized as a child. There was discipline in the home, rules to follow, and a strong emphasis on faith, but very little emotional attention. Due to their long work hours, Rader's parents paid little attention to their son, which led Dennis Rader to feel ignored. That absence of his parents mattered more than anything else. As a child, he appeared normal. He enjoyed fishing, comic books, and scouting, just like any other normal child. Teachers didn't flag him as dangerous. Neighbors didn't find him strange. To most people, he was quiet, almost forgettable. But privately, something was already forming. From a young age, Rader began developing violent fantasies centered on control, specifically over people he viewed as powerless. These thoughts weren't fleeting or accidental. They became routine, rehearsed, comforting. Around the same time, he began harming animals in secret, a behavior that would later stand out as one of the clearest early warning signs. He could often capture, torture, and kill small animals, all for his pleasure. As he grew older, his behavior became more secretive. He watched women in his neighborhood without their knowledge, often catching glimpses of them changing in their room. He constructed private habits that revolved around domination and restraint of women. He even indulged in self-strangulation and dressing up in women's clothing to feel some kind of twisted pleasure. None of it was visible to the outside world. After graduating high school in 1963, he attended college briefly. He struggled academically, failed to connect with others, and dropped out after a year. Dennis Rader joined the United States Air Force in 1966. For the first time in his life, he had structure. He completed his training in Texas, then began moving from base to base: Alabama, Turkey, Greece, South Korea, and eventually Japan. His job involved installing and maintaining communication equipment, work that required patience, precision, and strict attention to detail. And by all official measures, Rader did well. He earned medals for good conduct and qualified in marksmanship. To his superiors, he wasn't exceptional, but he was reliable. Years later, Rader would claim that his time in the Air Force shaped him in ways he didn't fully understand at the time. Not just discipline, but knowledge, confidence, a sense of authority. In 1970, he received an honorable discharge at the rank of Staff Sergeant. He returned to Kansas and began building what looked like a stable adult life. He bought a home in a quiet suburb near Wichita. He enrolled in community college, studying electronics. Later, he continued on to earn a degree in administration of justice. That choice would prove unsettling in hindsight. Rader bounced between jobs early on, working in a grocery store meat department, then as an assembler for an outdoor equipment company. In 1971, Dennis Rader got married. He married Paula Dietz, a secretary, in a church ceremony surrounded by family and friends. From the outside, it looked like the beginning of a normal, stable life. Over the next few years, they had 2 children, a daughter and a son. They bought a home in Park City, Kansas, just outside Wichita. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved, lawns were trimmed, and nothing ever seemed out of place. Then came the job that would define the irony of his double life. In 1974, Dennis Rader was hired by ADT Security Services. His role was to install home security systems, alarms meant to protect families from intruders. At work, Rader was known as a strict rule follower. He corrected co-workers. He discouraged casual conversation. He earned a nickname, Blue Book Man, for always sticking rigidly to procedure. To his colleagues, he wasn't dangerous. He was just irritating. During all these years, Dennis Rader looked unharmful to all the people around him, but his sick fantasies hadn't left him by any means. Instead, his fantasies were taking form in a much, much stronger way. He still indulged in his sick private activities and still fantasized about harming women and taking control of them for his pleasure. Getting married and having a family of his own hadn't changed him at all, and somewhere around this, he had finally made up his mind. Sometime in 1973, Dennis Rader saw a woman named Julie Oterio leaving her house to take her children to school. Instantly, he picked her as his first victim. For months, he stalked Julie and found she had a husband named Joseph, and altogether they had 5 children. He monitored the movements and routine of the family and took track of where each family member would be at a given time. He noticed that 3 older children left for school during the day, and there would just be Julie, her husband, and 2 younger children at home. Dennis Rader soon finalized that this time would be best for him to take action. On January 15, 1974, Rader parked his car and walked to the Otero residence, scaled a fence, and cut the phone lines in the backyard. There, he encountered Joseph and pulled a Jim on him and threatened his way into the home. At first, the family thought the man in their home was joking. He spoke calmly, almost casually, as if the situation wasn't serious. But when he made it clear that he was armed and that this was not a prank, the mood shifted instantly. He told them he was a fugitive, claimed he was wanted in another state, and ordered everyone to lie down. The instructions were clear. There was no shouting, no panic in his voice. He was in control. The family was moved into a bedroom where he used rope he had brought with him in advance. This wasn't improvised. This was planned. Rader later claimed he hadn't planned to kill the entire family, but once they were restrained, the decision became inevitable. What followed was methodical and deeply disturbing. He moved from one victim to the next, responding to their suffering not with urgency or hesitation, but with pleasure. When it was over, the house was silent. But he wasn't finished yet. He took the youngest member of the family to the basement. What happened next was so disturbing that even describing it feels wrong. so we won't." He left the house, drove the family's car to a grocery store parking lot, and only then realized he had forgotten something. So he calmly returned to the scene, retrieved the item, and left again, this time for good. That was the first known crime committed by Dennis Rader, and it wouldn't be the last. The following day, Wichita was thrown into chaos. A large task force formed almost immediately, working under intense public pressure to deliver answers fast. Leads poured in. Tips overwhelmed phone lines. Everyone wanted the incident to not be true. This attack on an innocent family completely shook the town into fear. Then it appeared to. A young man stepped forward and confessed, claiming involvement in the murders. For a brief moment, it looked like the case might be closed. Police began sorting through his statements, checking details and comparing, and timelines. But something didn't sit right. The confession didn't hold up. Meanwhile, Dennis Rader, the real killer, was paying close attention. Not with relief, but with anger. Because someone else was about to take credit for what he believed was his work. Within weeks, the investigation was interrupted by a message delivered through the media. Dennis Rader, anonymously, directed authorities to a letter hidden inside a library book, one that contained details of the murders that had never been released publicly. Those details immediately exposed the confession as false. The message wasn't meant to advance the case. It was meant to correct the record. For the first time, Wichita understood that the killer was not only capable of violence, but attentive, following the investigation closely and reacting when the attention shifted away from him. Recognition mattered, and by intervening to reclaim ownership of the crime, he made one thing clear: he had no intention of, disappearing quietly. In April of 1974, Dennis Rader targeted a young woman named Catherine Bright. He had been watching her for some time and believed he understood her routine. What he didn't anticipate was that she wouldn't be alone. When Rader entered the house, he encountered Catherine and her younger brother, Kevin Bright. The presence of a second person immediately disrupted his plan. Control, which Rader depended on above all else, became difficult to maintain. He separated the siblings, attempting to manage them one at a time. But unlike his first crime, things did not stay quiet or orderly. Kevin resisted. He fought back. Despite being seriously injured, he managed to escape the house and run for help. That escape changed everything. Rader fled the scene before he could fully carry out what he intended. Kevin Bright survived and was able to give police a first-hand account of the attack, something investigators had not had before. But the description was too generic to narrow suspects. Catherine Bright was rushed to the hospital but later died from her injuries. The attack revealed critical weaknesses. Rader struggled when confronted with resistance. He became disorganized when his expectations were challenged. His control was fragile. What allowed him to avoid capture wasn't skill or precision. It was timing and luck. He didn't stand out by any means, so it was really hard for the witness and the investigators to find and identify him. After the failed attack, Dennis Rader disappeared. There were no letters, no messages, and no confirmed murders. To the public, it looked like the threat had passed. To investigators, the case stalled with nothing solid to chase. Tips dried up. The task force shrank. Attention moved elsewhere. But the silence wasn't an ending. Behind the scenes, Rader continued stalking neighborhoods. He watched routines. He tested doors. He broke into houses simply to see if he could, and left without taking anything. Sometimes he stole small, intimate items. Sometimes he walked away empty-handed. He rehearsed, fantasized his movements, and refined what had gone wrong. Most importantly, he learned restraint. If conditions didn't feel right, he aborted. If the risk rose too high, he went home. Control mattered more than action. To the city, BTK seemed gone. To Rader, this was discipline, and discipline meant time was on his side. Pause, delete this part. In 1977, Dennis Rader ended his silence. After nearly 3 years with no confirmed activity, he struck again. The murders came as a shock, precisely because many believed the danger had faded. There had been no warnings, no build-up, just the sudden realization that the killer was still capable, still active, and still nearby. This time, Rader didn't wait long to reassert himself. Soon after the killings, messages followed. He contacted police and the media to make sure there was no ambiguity about who was responsible. The communications were deliberate and corrective, aimed at tying these crimes directly to the earlier ones and reaffirming a single offender behind them. What mattered to him wasn't simply that the murders occurred, it was that they were recognized. By now, investigators could see a consistent pattern taking shape. Rader operated in bursts. He killed, then watched. He communicated, then listened. And once he felt certain that fear and attention had returned, that his presence was acknowledged, he stopped again. No escalation, no attempt to press his advantage, just withdrawal. The silence that followed wasn't confusion or exhaustion. It was intentional. Rader had learned that disappearance was as powerful as violence. And once again, Wichita was left waiting, unsure if the killer was gone or merely preparing for another return. While police searched for a predator, Dennis Rader was building something else entirely. He was married. He had a family of his own. He went back to school, earned degrees, and was deeply involved in his church. On paper, his life looked steady, almost exemplary. He held jobs, he followed routines, he showed up where he was expected to be. Nothing about him suggested chaos or danger. To neighbors, Rader was strict and inflexible. To co-workers, he was a rule follower who took procedures too seriously. He corrected people. He enforced standards. He could be irritating, but he was also predictable. And predictability for him was camouflage. By surrounding himself with normalcy, Rader created distance between who he was and what he had done. Exactly the kind of distance he needed. Because the more ordinary he appeared, the less anyone would ever think to look twice. From 1974 through the late 1980s, Dennis Rader worked for ADT Security Services in Wichita. His job was simple and trusted, installing home security systems. Families invited him inside because he represented safety. He walked through bedrooms, living rooms, back doors, spaces normally reserved for friends and family. Some of the homeowners he visited were afraid. They had heard rumors about a killer stalking Wichita. They were buying alarms precisely because of that fear. And Rader stood in their homes explaining how to keep themselves safe. This job gave him something no disguise ever could: unquestioned access. He didn't need to sneak or watch from a distance. He was welcomed, trusted, forgotten as soon as he left. By the mid-1980s, Dennis Rader returned to violence again, this time with long gaps between attacks. The spacing was deliberate. Years passed between murders, giving investigators nothing to pattern, nothing to anticipate. Each time he acted, it was because the risk felt acceptable. If conditions weren't right, he walked away. If anything threatened his sense of control, he aborted. When he did strike, it was calculated and brief. During this period, Rader began taking souvenirs and photographs. These weren't necessary to commit the crimes. They were unnecessary risks. But they fed something he needed: proof, memory, ownership. The acts alone were no longer enough. He wanted something he could keep. Each decision increased the chance of exposure, but it didn't happen. There were no witnesses who identified him. There was no evidence that led back to his door. Once again, he disappeared after each attack, returning to work, family, and routine as if nothing had happened. By any reasonable measure, he should have been caught by now. But he wasn't. Luck, combined with caution and timing, was still holding. From the beginning, Dennis Rader didn't just want to kill. He wanted to be acknowledged. When recognition didn't come on its own, he forced it. In December 1977, one day after killing Nancy Fox, Rader called police from a payphone and calmly told them where to find her body. The call was recorded and later released publicly. Tips flooded in. None identified him. But once again, he had succeeded in making himself heard. In January 1978, he followed with a letter containing a mocking poem describing the murder of Shirley Vian. The tone was taunting, almost playful. When the letter arrived weeks late, he was furious. Timing mattered to him. Being current mattered. A month later, he wrote again, this time to Keiki TV. The motive was no longer subtle. He demanded attention outright, asking how many people he would have to kill before he earned a name in the paper or national coverage. He repeated the BTK label, suggested alternate names, and framed his violence as the result of something he called Factor X, a force he claimed linked him to other infamous killers. He instructed police to respond to him through hidden messages. Enclosed was another poem, turning murder into performance. Not every fixation ended in violence. In 1979, Rader became obsessed with a woman named Anna Williams. He broke into her home and waited for hours. She never returned. Angry and frustrated, he left. 2 months later, he returned only to communicate, leaving a letter outside her home titled, "Oh Anna, why didn't you appear?" signed BTK, along with items taken during the burglary. Even failure needed documentation. By the late 1980s, his communications shifted again. In 1988, he mailed a poem referencing the murder of another family, crimes he did not commit. He included drawings and commentary, expressing admiration rather than responsibility. He wasn't confessing. He was inserting himself into violence wherever he could, aligning his identity with killing, even when it wasn't his own. Across decades, the pattern never changed. Violence triggered communication. Recognition ended it. Rader didn't write to evade capture. He wrote to be seen. And whenever the attention faded, he found a way to pull it back. In early 1991, Dennis Rader targeted a woman named Dolores Davis, a recent widow living in Park City, Kansas. Rader had been watching the house for some time. His original interest was not spontaneous. He had studied routines and waited for an opportunity that felt low risk. Unlike earlier crimes, this one showed signs of urgency rather than indulgence. On the night of the attack, Rader forced his way into the home. The encounter was brief and hurried, shaped by the fear of interruption rather than the control he had once sought. Davis was killed inside her home. This time, Rader did not linger. He removed the body from the house and disposed of it at a remote location outside the city. The decision to move the body marked a shift in his behavior, less theatrical, less communicative, and more focused on escape. Afterward, he returned to the house to remove evidence and then went back to his normal routine. And then, nothing. There were no letters, no taunts, no attempts to claim credit. Dolores Davis's disappearance remained unsolved for years. Her body was not discovered until much later, and at the time, there was no clear link tying her death to BTK. For Rader, this crime marked the end. not because he was satisfied, but because the risk had finally begun to outweigh the reward. And from that moment on, the killer who once demanded attention chose silence instead. By the 1990s, the investigation had gone cold. Files were boxed, leads dried up, detectives retired or moved on, and BTK became a name buried in old reports rather than an active threat. New officers inherited the case with nothing new to chase. For them, it was history. So was fear. A new generation grew up in Wichita having only vague awareness of the crimes. The name BTK surfaced occasionally, in anniversary articles, in speculation, but without urgency. Some reports suggested the killer was dead. Others guessed he had been imprisoned for an unrelated crime. A few dismissed him as a relic of a different era. Silence stretched into years. To the public, BTK no longer felt present. He wasn't stalking neighborhoods. He wasn't writing letters. He wasn't killing. The city moved on. They thought the killer was maybe locked up for another crime, or was dead, or had moved on to another state or country. But Dennis Rader was always there in Wichita, and being forgotten, written off as irrelevant, obsolete, or finished, was something he could not tolerate for long. In January 2004, on the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders, a newspaper article revisited the BTK case. Its conclusion was blunt. BTK was no longer a threat. If he was alive at all, he was irrelevant. For decades, police work had failed to draw him out. Silence, pressure, investigation, none of it worked. But that single implication did. For Dennis Rader, the suggestion that he had faded into history was intolerable. The idea that he was forgotten, dismissed as finished, cut deeper than any risk of exposure. Within months, communication resumed. The silence that had lasted more than a decade ended not because he needed to kill again, but because he needed to be remembered. And once he stepped back into the spotlight, events moved faster than they ever had before. In late 2004, Dennis Rader resurfaced, but this time without killing anyone. Instead, he began leaving packages and messages around Wichita. The first items were small but deliberate. Packages left in public places, dropped where they would be found but not immediately traced back to him. Inside were things designed to prove authorship, photocopied documents, references to old crimes, and instructions written in his unmistakable tone. Not confessions, confirmations. Some packages contained word puzzles and riddles meant to show intelligence and control. Others included crime scene references that only the real BTK could know. He wasn't trying to shock. He was trying to authenticate. Then came the props. One of the most disturbing was a posed Barbie doll, bound and staged to resemble a victim from the Otero murders. It was placed inside a cereal box and left for police to find. The message wasn't subtle. This was nostalgia, not threat. A reminder of what he had done, and that he expected it to be remembered. He also sent handwritten notes, some rambling, some corrective, some instructive. He told the police how to respond to him. He criticized past coverage. He offered timelines, hints, and false leads. In his mind, he was managing the investigation from the outside. At one point, he included personal items taken from victims years earlier, kept all that time as proof and leverage. These weren't mistakes. They were trophies repurposed as credentials. He wasn't killing. He was curating his legacy. But every package required contact with the real world. Every drop-off created a location. Every message revealed habits, language patterns, routines, confidence levels. The more he tried to demonstrate control, the more information he surrendered. What Rader saw as a careful return was, in reality, a slow self-exposure. And the longer he kept reminding the world that BTK still existed, the easier it became to figure out who was reminding them. Then, in early 2005, Dennis Rader crossed a line he had avoided for more than 30 years. After months of renewed communication, letters, packages, props, instructions, he paused and asked a question. Through the help of the media, in a way that ensured police would answer him in public, Dennis Rader asked a very simple question. If he provided his writings in a floppy disk, could it be traced back to him? For the first time, Rader wasn't boasting or demanding attention. He was seeking confirmation. He wanted reassurance that the next step would be safe. Police understood the moment immediately. They responded publicly in the newspaper, reassuring him that a floppy disk would be acceptable, carefully avoiding any mention of tracing. The answer, of course, was deliberate and also false. Investigators weren't interested in what Rader planned to say on the disk. They were interested in what the disk itself could reveal: file properties, metadata, usernames, the kind of information Rader didn't think about and didn't know how to remove. Rader accepted the answer without hesitation. All police had to do now was wait. In February 2005, the gamble paid off. A floppy disk arrived at a local TV station, delivered just as Dennis Rader had promised. Inside was a single file, a simple document, nothing elaborate. The message itself barely mattered. Investigators didn't start by reading it. They right-clicked. They opened the file's properties. And within seconds, decades of mystery began to collapse. The metadata listed an author name, Dennis Rader. It also listed an organization, Christ Lutheran Church. That was enough. From there, everything accelerated. Detectives cross-referenced church records, employment histories, and residences. One name fit perfectly: a middle-aged man living in Park City, a church official, a former security installer, a city compliance officer, a man who had never appeared on any suspect list. Within hours, the case that had resisted every task force, every profiler, and every forensic limitation suddenly had a face. Rader believed the disk made him untouchable. Instead, it identified him. What 30 years of silence, caution, and luck had protected was undone by a single file property, something he never thought to check. And once investigators saw that name, there was no going back. The hunt was over. All that remained was confirmation. After the floppy disk pointed them to Dennis Rader, investigators didn't rush to make an arrest. A name wasn't enough. After 30 years, they needed certainty. They found it through DNA. Rader had never been arrested before, so his DNA wasn't in any criminal database. Instead, police used a workaround. They obtained medical DNA from one of his children through routine health records. The sample was legally compared to biological evidence preserved from multiple BTK crime scenes. The match was conclusive. With confirmation in hand, police arrested Rader quietly in February 2005, pulling him over near his home under the pretense of a routine stop. He didn't resist. He didn't panic. He seemed almost confused. During interrogation, the facade collapsed quickly. Once confronted with the DNA evidence, Rader confessed. He walked detectives through his crimes with clinical detail, correcting them when he thought they got something wrong. What surprised him wasn't that he'd been caught, it was how. He expressed genuine disbelief that police had lied to him about the floppy disk. He viewed it as a breach of professional trust. Speaking in his mind, from one law enforcement officer to another. That reaction said everything. After decades of evasion, Rader hadn't been undone by brilliance or persistence alone. He'd been undone by his own assumption that he was still in control, and that authority would play fair with him. It didn't. And with that, the man who demanded to be seen finally was in handcuffs. In 2005, Dennis Rader stood in a Kansas courtroom and ended any remaining uncertainty. He pled guilty. There was no dramatic outburst, no denial, no attempt to minimize what he had done. Instead, Rader calmly described his crimes one by one, speaking in procedural language, as if he were walking through tasks rather than lives taken. He corrected prosecutors on dates. He explained methods. He showed no visible emotion. For the families in the courtroom, it was unbearable. For Rader, control was reclaimed, one last time. Kansas law did not allow the death penalty for his crimes, but the sentence left no ambiguity. He received 10 consecutive life sentences, one for each murder he admitted to. No parole, no possibility of release. The man who had demanded attention for decades would spend the rest of his life in prison, stripped of anonymity, stripped of power, stripped of the persona he had built. The consequences didn't end with him. His wife, Paula Dietz, was granted an emergency divorce within days of his arrest. She later stated that she had no knowledge of his crimes and had lived with him for more than 30 years without suspecting anything beyond rigidity and control. Their home was eventually demolished, as if the ground itself needed distance. Their children were blindsided. Rader's daughter learned the truth when federal agents arrived at her door. In a single moment, her past fractured. Her childhood memories, church events, family routines, a strict but present father were suddenly recontextualized. She would later speak openly about the trauma of realizing that the man who raised her was also a serial killer, and about the long process of separating her own identity from his crimes. The family changed their names. They disappeared from public life. They paid for a legacy they did not choose. In the end, BTK wasn't caught by superior intelligence or relentless force. He was caught because he could not tolerate being forgotten. His need for recognition pulled him back into the world. Each message, each demand for attention, stripped away a layer of the disguise that had protected him for decades. The silence that once kept him free was broken by his own voice, and the man who believed he controlled everything learned, too late, that invisibility, not notoriety, was the only thing standing between him and capture. When he finally got the attention he craved, it came with handcuffs.